The Miami-Dade County Courthouse stood tall and imposing against the bright Florida sky on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning in September. The marble halls echoed with the usual sounds of justice in motion: shuffling papers, hushed conversations, and the steady click of dress shoes against polished floors. Inside courtroom 305, Judge Patricia Henderson sat behind her elevated bench, her black robes pressed and perfect, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. At 58 years old, she had earned a reputation among courthouse regulars for being particularly harsh with defendants, especially those from minority communities. Today, her calendar was filled with routine traffic violations and minor offenses. The courtroom was packed with the usual morning crowd: nervous defendants, board attorneys, and court officers maintaining order. The air conditioning hummed steadily, barely keeping up with the Miami heat that seemed to seep through the walls. "Next case," Judge Henderson called out, her voice sharp and impatient. She barely glanced up from her papers as the bailiff announced, "Case number 2023 TR 1542, James Wilson." A well-dressed black man in his early 40s approached the podium. James Wilson stood out immediately from the typical defendants in traffic court. His charcoal gray suit was perfectly tailored, his shoes were expertly shined, and his posture spoke of confidence and discipline. He carried a leather briefcase and moved with the measured steps of someone used to navigating important spaces. The moment Wilson opened his mouth to speak, Judge Henderson's demeanor shifted. Her eyes narrowed, and a small, dismissive smile played at the corners of her mouth. "State your name for the record," she interrupted, though he had barely begun. "James Wilson, Your Honor," he replied calmly, his deep voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "And you're here for running a red light, Mr. Wilson?" Judge Henderson's tone dripped with condescension. She emphasized his name in a way that made several heads turn in the gallery. "Your Honor, if I may explain the circumstances," Wilson began, maintaining his professional composure. Judge Henderson let out a short laugh that echoed through the suddenly quiet courtroom. "Oh, there are always circumstances, aren't there, Mr. Wilson?" She made a show of shuffling through his file. "Let me guess, you were late for something important. The light was yellow? You didn't see it?" The public defender assigned to the morning's traffic cases shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even the court reporter's fingers hesitated over her stenotype machine for a moment. Wilson stood straight, his expression neutral despite the judge's obvious mockery. "Your Honor, on the night in question, I was responding to a time-sensitive—" "Mr. Wilson," Judge Henderson cut him off again, her voice rising. "This is a simple matter. You either ran the red light or you didn't. I don't need a story about how special your situation was." The tension in the courtroom grew thick. Other defendants waiting their turn watched with a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. A young law clerk in the corner began taking detailed notes, clearly troubled by what she was witnessing. Wilson reached slowly for his briefcase, saying, "Your Honor, if you would allow me to present my credentials." "Credentials?" Judge Henderson's laugh was louder this time, almost theatrical. "Mr. Wilson, this isn't a job interview. This is traffic court. Unless you have a valid excuse for running that light, which," she paused for effect, looking around the courtroom as if seeking appreciation for her wit, "I seriously doubt you do, then we can proceed with your fine." Several people in the gallery shifted in their seats, the uncomfortable atmosphere growing by the second. A veteran court officer near the door had begun paying closer attention to the exchange, his years of experience telling him something unusual was unfolding. Wilson remained steady, his hand still on his briefcase. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I believe my credentials are relevant to this case." "Mr. Wilson," Judge Henderson's voice took on a warning tone, "I'm beginning to lose patience. Your credentials have nothing to do with your inability to obey basic traffic laws. Unless you'd like to add contempt of court to your charges, I suggest you—" The courtroom doors opened, and two men in dark suits entered quietly, taking positions near the back wall. Their presence went unnoticed by Judge Henderson, who was too focused on her target, but several attorneys in the room recognized the telltale signs of federal agents. As the morning sun streamed through the high windows of courtroom 305, casting long shadows across the floor, no one present could have predicted how the next few moments would permanently change the course of many lives, particularly that of Judge Patricia Henderson. The tension in courtroom 305 continued to build as Judge Henderson's treatment of James Wilson grew increasingly hostile. The morning sun now filled the room completely, highlighting the beads of sweat forming on several observers' foreheads, though not from the heat alone. "Your Honor," Wilson tried again, his voice remaining steady despite the judge's obvious antagonism. "If you would just allow me to." "Mr. Wilson," Judge Henderson's voice cut through the air like a knife. "I've handled hundreds of defendants like you who think they're special, who think the rules don't apply to them." She leaned forward, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose, a smirk playing across her face. "Tell me, what makes you so different?" Several gasps echoed through the courtroom at her obvious prejudice. The young law clerk in the corner was now frantically typing on her phone, documenting every word of the exchange. The two men in dark suits who had entered earlier remained motionless, their expressions unreadable. "Ma'am," Wilson began, switching tactics, "I understand this appears to be a routine traffic violation, but there are security implications that—" Judge Henderson's laugh echoed off the walls, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Security implications? Oh, this is rich." She looked around the courtroom, seeking validation from her audience, but found only uncomfortable faces avoiding her gaze. "Let me guess, you were on some sort of secret mission, weren't you?" The public defender finally stood up, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, if I may." "Sit down, Counselor," Henderson snapped. "Mr. Wilson here seems perfectly capable of digging his own hole." The veteran court officer near the door had now moved closer to the bench, his years of experience telling him something was very wrong with this situation. The two men in suits at the back of the room exchanged a brief glance. Wilson's hand remained on his briefcase, his knuckles whitening slightly, the only visible sign of his growing frustration. "Your Honor, I'm trying to explain that on the night in question, I was responding to a matter of national security, of course." Judge Henderson threw her hands up in mock surprise. "First time I've heard that one in traffic court." Her sarcasm was palpable. "Tell me, Mr. Wilson, are you also going to tell me you're a secret agent, perhaps James Bond himself?" A few nervous laughs echoed from the gallery, quickly silenced by the intensity of the moment. The court reporter had stopped typing entirely, staring at the scene unfolding before her with growing concern. "Judge Henderson," Wilson spoke her name for the first time, his tone shifting ever so slightly. "I am giving you one final opportunity to allow me to present my credentials before." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Wilson?" Judge Henderson's voice rose sharply, her face flushing with anger. "Because I can assure you, that would be a very serious mistake." The two men in suits at the back of the room began moving forward slowly, their movements deliberate and coordinated. More people in the courtroom started noticing their presence, creating a ripple of whispers. "No threat, Your Honor," Wilson replied calmly. "Simply a statement of fact." The tension in courtroom 305 had reached its breaking point. Judge Henderson's face was twisted with anger as she watched James Wilson slowly withdraw a black leather wallet from his briefcase. The morning sunlight glinted off the gold emblem embedded in its surface. "If you're showing me a driver's license, Mr. Wilson, I assure you I've already seen it in your file," Judge Henderson sneered, her voice dripping with disdain. "Though I must say, your attitude is only making things worse for yourself." The two men in suits had now reached the middle of the courtroom, their presence commanding attention from everyone except the judge, who remained focused on belittling the man before her. Wilson held the wallet at chest level, still closed. "Your Honor, what I'm about to show you is my official identification as a senior operations officer with the Central Intelligence Agency." Before he could open the wallet, Judge Henderson burst into loud, mocking laughter. Several people in the gallery exchanged worried glances, and the court reporter's hands hovered uncertainly over her machine. "Oh, this is priceless." Judge Henderson wiped at her eyes, her laughter echoing off the walls. "First, you were on a secret mission, and now you're claiming to be CIA. Mr. Wilson, I've heard some creative excuses in my courtroom, but this one deserves an award." The young law clerk in the corner had stopped typing, her mouth slightly open in shock at the judge's behavior. The public defender had his head in his hands, unable to watch the scene unfolding before him. "Your Honor," one of the suited men finally spoke up, his voice carrying authority that immediately silenced the courtroom. I am Special Agent Thomas Parker with the FBI's Miami field office. We're here to verify Mr. Wilson's credentials. Judge Henderson's laughter caught in her throat. For the first time, she seemed to notice the two federal agents standing in her courtroom. Her expression flickered briefly, but she quickly recovered her composure. Even if he does work for the government, she said, her voice slightly less certain, that doesn't excuse running a red light. No one is above the law in my courtroom. Wilson finally opened the wallet. The next hour in courtroom 305 unfolded like a scene from a dramatic movie. After Wilson's revelation and Judge Henderson's stammered dismissal, the usual orderly proceedings of the court had completely broken down. The remaining defendants scheduled for that morning's traffic court sat wide-eyed in the gallery, whispering among themselves. Many had their phones out, though court rules prohibited recording. The young law clerk, Sarah Martinez, had already sent her detailed notes to the State Bar Association and the Judicial Review Board. Judge Henderson remained behind her bench, appearing significantly smaller than she had just an hour ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she attempted to shuffle through papers, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Your Honor, Special Agent Parker approached the bench, his voice firm but professional. We need to discuss what happened here today. Would you prefer to do this in your chambers? Before she could respond, the courthouse's chief judge, Michael Roberts, strode into the courtroom. His presence immediately commanded attention, and the whispers in the gallery fell silent. He had obviously been informed of the situation, given his grim expression. This court is in recess, Chief Judge Roberts announced, his deep voice leaving no room for argument. All remaining cases will be reassigned. Please see the clerk's office for your new court dates. As the gallery began to clear out, several people paused to shake Wilson's hand or pat him on the back. The public defender, who had watched the entire scene unfold helplessly, approached him with an apologetic expression. Mr. Wilson, I'm so sorry. I should have intervened earlier when I saw how she was treating you, he said, genuine regret in his voice. Wilson nodded acknowledgement but kept his attention on the scene unfolding at the bench, where Chief Judge Roberts was now speaking in hushed but intense tones with Judge Henderson. Her face had lost all color, and she seemed to be fighting back tears. The two FBI agents stood nearby, documenting everything. The court reporter, who had witnessed countless dramatic moments in this courtroom over her 20-year career, continued to transcribe every word, knowing this transcript would likely be crucial in the coming investigation. Officer Wilson, Chief Judge Roberts called out, turning away from Judge Henderson. Would you join us in my chambers? We need to address this situation immediately. As Wilson gathered his belongings, Judge Henderson finally found her voice again. I want to apologize, she began, her words barely audible. Save it for the review board, Patricia. Chief Judge Roberts cut her off sharply. Your behavior today was not only unprofessional but potentially criminal. This isn't something a simple apology can fix. The small group made their way toward the judge's chambers, leaving the courtroom in disarray. Outside in the hallway, news of what had happened was already spreading through the courthouse like wildfire. Legal assistants, attorneys, and other court staff gathered in small clusters, discussing the morning's events in excited whispers. Sarah Martinez, the law clerk, was approached by several reporters who had somehow already gotten wind of the story. She clutched her phone, containing the detailed notes and recordings, close to her chest. Miss Martinez, one of the FBI agents called out to her. We'll need to talk to you as well. Your documentation of Judge Henderson's behavior over the past few months could be very valuable. Inside Chief Judge Roberts' chambers, Wilson sat calmly as the others gathered around the large mahogany conference table. Judge Henderson had been escorted to a separate room, where she waited with her hastily called attorney. Officer Wilson, Chief Judge Roberts began, on behalf of this court, I want to express our deepest apologies for what you experienced today. I assure you, this will be thoroughly investigated. Wilson nodded, maintaining his professional demeanor. Sir, my concern isn't just about my treatment today. Judge Henderson's behavior suggests a pattern of discrimination that needs to be addressed systemically. The FBI agents exchanged glances, and Agent Parker spoke up. We've already received multiple calls from other defendants who have appeared in Judge Henderson's court, sharing similar experiences. As the morning sun reached its peak outside the courthouse windows, The group inside the Chief Judge's chambers began the process of untangling what would become one of the most significant judicial misconduct cases in the state's history. The power dynamics of courtroom 305 had been permanently altered, and the ripples of this morning's events would continue to spread far beyond the walls of the Miami-Dade County Courthouse. By late afternoon, the Miami-Dade County Courthouse had transformed into a hive of activity. Local news vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. In a conference room overlooking downtown Miami, James Wilson sat with a team of investigators from the State Judicial Qualifications Commission. The room's large windows offered a view of gathering storm clouds, matching the gravity of the discussions taking place inside. Officer Wilson, began Commissioner Diana Rodriguez, a veteran investigator with silver streaked hair. We've reviewed the preliminary reports from this morning, but we need you to walk us through everything from the beginning. Wilson recounted the events with the same calm precision he used in his CIA field reports. As he spoke, another investigator played video clips captured by courtroom security cameras. The footage clearly showed Judge Henderson's sneering expressions and dismissive gestures. "We've also received this," Commissioner Rodriguez said, sliding a thick folder across the table. "It's a compilation of complaints against Judge Henderson from the past 3 years. Most were dismissed or buried, but Sarah Martinez, the law clerk, kept copies of everything." Meanwhile, 2 floors below, Sarah Martinez sat in another room with FBI agents, her phone and laptop open before her. The young law clerk's detailed documentation was proving invaluable. "I started keeping records after my second week working there," Sarah explained, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. "The way she treated minorities, especially black defendants, it was systematic. But nobody wanted to speak up because of her connections." In yet another part of the building, Judge Henderson sat with her attorney, Richard Blackwood, one of Miami's most expensive lawyers. Her judicial robes were gone, replaced by a simple blue blazer that seemed to swallow her diminished frame. "This is a disaster, Patricia," Blackwood said, pacing the small room. "We've got video evidence, multiple witnesses, and now this law clerk with months of documentation. What were you thinking?" Henderson stared out the window, her earlier arrogance replaced by shocked disbelief. "I never thought. How was I supposed to know he was CIA? That's exactly the problem." Blackwood exploded. "You shouldn't treat anyone that way, regardless of who they are." Back in the main conference room, Chief Judge Roberts had joined the investigation team. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his worried face as he reviewed the growing evidence. "We've pulled the statistics from Judge Henderson's court," an analyst reported. "In cases involving minority defendants, she handed down sentences averaging 40% longer than those for white defendants with similar charges. The pattern is undeniable." Wilson listened quietly, his CIA training evident in his careful observation of everyone in the room. The storm clouds outside had grown darker, and distant thunder rolled across the city. "There's more," Commissioner Rodriguez added, pulling up more files on her laptop. "We've found financial connections between Judge Henderson and private prison companies. Every harsh sentence she handed down potentially benefited her investment portfolio." The revelation sent a shockwave through the room. What had started as an investigation into racial bias was expanding into something much larger. "We'll need protection for Sarah Martinez," Wilson spoke up, his professional instincts kicking in. "Once this goes public, Judge Henderson's allies might try to discredit her or worse." Chief Judge Roberts nodded grimly. "I've already arranged for court security to escort her home. The FBI has also offered protection, given the potential scope of this case." Outside the courthouse, the media presence had grown. Reporters speculated about the unusual activity, though the full story hadn't yet broken. The storm clouds finally opened up, sending sheets of rain against the building's windows. "Officer Wilson," Commissioner Rodriguez said, closing her laptop, "your experience this morning may have finally broken the dam of silence. We've already received calls from dozens of other defendants who appeared in Judge Henderson's court." The rain continued to pour outside as the investigation team worked into the evening. What had started as a simple traffic court incident was unraveling years of judicial misconduct, systemic racism, and possible criminal behavior. In the building's parking garage, Judge Henderson and her attorney hurried to a waiting car, trying to avoid the media. The once powerful judge kept her head down, her world crumbling around her as the storm raged on. The day's events had set in motion changes that would ripple through the judicial system for years to come, all because one man refused to accept injustice, even in its most official forms. The next morning, Miami woke up to explosive headlines across every major news outlet. In her small apartment, Sarah Martinez sat watching the morning news, surrounded by FBI agents who had been assigned to protect her. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn with messages from journalists seeking comments. Breaking news, the TV anchor announced, her expression serious. We have obtained exclusive footage from inside courtroom 305 showing Judge Patricia Henderson's confrontation with CIA officer James Wilson. Viewers should note that this footage contains disturbing examples of judicial misconduct. The video played across screens throughout Miami, showing Judge Henderson's sneering face and mocking behavior. The audio was crystal clear, capturing every discriminatory comment and dismissive laugh. Social media exploded with outrage as the clip went viral. At the CIA's Miami field office, James Wilson sat in a secure conference room with his superiors. The agency, usually reluctant to acknowledge its officers publicly, had made an exception given the circumstances. "You've opened quite a hornet's nest," Wilson, his supervisor, Deputy Director Thompson, remarked while reviewing the morning's papers. "But the agency stands behind you. This kind of discrimination cannot be tolerated in our justice system." Meanwhile, at her expensive Bayfront home, Judge Henderson faced a mob of reporters camped outside her gates. Her phone rang constantly with calls from former colleagues, most of them suddenly eager to distance themselves from her. "Patricia," her lawyer's voice crackled through the speakerphone, "it's worse than we thought. The State Bar Association has just announced an emergency meeting. They're talking about recommending immediate suspension of your law license." The investigation had expanded beyond just Judge Henderson. The courthouse was swarming with state investigators, reviewing years of case files and financial records. Several court employees had come forward with additional evidence of misconduct. In a downtown coffee shop, two veteran court officers discussed the situation over their morning coffee. "You know what's crazy?" one said to the other. "We all saw it happening. Every day, we watched her treat people differently based on their race. But nobody said anything." "Fear," his colleague replied, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "She had connections. Everyone knew crossing her meant career suicide, until yesterday." By midday, the governor's office had released a statement. "We are deeply disturbed by the evidence of systematic discrimination in Judge Henderson's courtroom. We have initiated proceedings for her immediate suspension and are calling for a comprehensive review of all her past cases." Sarah Martinez's detailed records have become the backbone of the investigation. Her meticulous documentation included dates, times, specific comments, and sentencing disparities. The young law clerk had effectively built an irrefutable case against one of Miami's most powerful judges. Miss Martinez's courage in documenting these incidents cannot be overstated. Commissioner Rodriguez told reporters outside the courthouse. While others looked away, she chose to record the truth, knowing the potential risks to her career. The Miami legal community was in turmoil. Other judges scrambled to review their own records, worried about similar scrutiny. Law firms that had regularly appeared before Judge Henderson issued carefully worded statements expressing shock and disappointment. In the late afternoon, James Wilson received an unexpected call. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund wanted to meet with him. They saw an opportunity to use this case as a catalyst for broader judicial reform. "Your experience, combined with Miss Martinez's documentation, provides unprecedented evidence of systemic racism in our courts," the representative explained. "We believe this could lead to meaningful change." At sunset, Chief Judge Roberts held a press conference on the courthouse steps. Behind him stood a diverse group of legal professionals, including Wilson, Sarah Martinez, and several attorneys who had previously faced Judge Henderson's discrimination. "Today marks the beginning of a new era in our judicial system," Roberts declared, his voice firm. "We are establishing a task force to review all cases of potential discrimination, not just in Judge Henderson's court, but throughout our jurisdiction. The truth must come to light, no matter how uncomfortable it may be." As evening fell over Miami, the story continued to grow. National news networks picked up the footage. turning a local scandal into a nationwide conversation about judicial accountability and racial bias in the courts. What had started as a simple traffic court appearance had evolved into something much more significant, a moment of reckoning for a system that had too long turned a blind eye to discrimination in its midst. 1 week after the courthouse confrontation, the impact of James Wilson's traffic court appearance continued to send shockwaves through Miami's legal system. The story had grown far beyond a single incident of judicial misconduct, revealing deep-rooted problems that could no longer be ignored. In a packed hearing room at the state Supreme Court building, Judge Patricia Henderson faced the Judicial Qualifications Commission. Gone was her trademark arrogance, replaced by a nervous demeanor as she sat before her peers. Judge Henderson, Commission Chairman Robert Maxwell began, his voice echoing in the silent room, "We have reviewed over 2,000 cases from your court. The pattern of discrimination is undeniable. How do you respond to these findings?" Henderson's expensive attorney tried to intervene, but she raised her hand to stop him. For the first time, the gravity of her actions seemed to hit her fully. I have no defense," she said, her voice barely audible. "Looking at the evidence, at my own words and actions, I failed to uphold the principles of justice I swore to protect." Meanwhile, across town, Sarah Martinez was being interviewed by the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Her documentation had sparked a broader investigation into systemic discrimination throughout Florida's court system. "It wasn't just Judge Henderson," Sarah explained, pointing to her detailed spreadsheets. "She was just the most obvious example. The problem runs much deeper." The FBI's investigation had uncovered disturbing financial connections. Judge Henderson's investments in private prisons represented just the tip of the iceberg. A network of judges across the state had similar conflicts of interest, profiting from harsh sentences given to minority defendants. James Wilson, whose simple traffic ticket had triggered this avalanche of revelations, sat in meetings with civil rights organizations and reform advocates. His CIA training helped him analyze the complex web of corruption and discrimination they were uncovering. "We need to understand something," Wilson told a group of legal reform activists. "This isn't about one racist judge. This is about a system that allowed that racism to flourish unchecked for years." The Miami-Dade courthouse had become ground zero for a national conversation about judicial reform. News crews maintained a constant presence outside, broadcasting regular updates as more revelations emerged. "Breaking news," a CNN reporter announced from the courthouse steps. 3 more judges have resigned today following evidence of similar discriminatory practices. Sources say more resignations are expected. Inside the courthouse, Chief Judge Roberts worked with a task force to implement immediate reforms. New guidelines for judicial conduct were being written, with input from civil rights organizations and community leaders. "Every case from Judge Henderson's court will be reviewed," Roberts announced to the press. "Any defendant who faced discriminatory treatment will have their case reconsidered. This is just the beginning of our commitment to reform." The young defendants who had suffered under Henderson's prejudiced rulings began coming forward with their stories. Local law firms offered pro bono services to help them appeal their cases. "She gave me 3 years for a minor drug possession," one young man told reporters, fighting back tears. "My white cellmate had the same charge but only got probation. Now I know why." Late one evening, Sarah Martinez received an unexpected visitor at her protected location. It was James Wilson, carrying a thick folder. "The CIA has authorized me to share some information," he told her. "Your documentation, combined with our intelligence, has exposed corruption far beyond Miami. This goes to the state level, possibly higher." The investigation had begun attracting attention from Washington. Congressional committees were planning hearings on judicial discrimination and reform. Judge Henderson's case would be used as a primary example of how prejudice could poison the justice system. At her home, now under surveillance due to death threats, Henderson watched her career and reputation crumble on national television. Her membership in exclusive clubs had been revoked, her social circle had evaporated, and her own family had distanced themselves. "The damage you've done to these people, to the system itself, is immeasurable," her lawyer told her, preparing for the next day's disciplinary hearing. "There's no coming back from this." As the sun set over Miami that evening, the courthouse stood as a symbol of both shame and hope. shame for the injustices it had housed, and hope for the changes now beginning to take root. The story had evolved from a single act of discrimination to a movement for systemic change, proving that sometimes the biggest transformations start with the smallest moments of courage. 1 month after the fateful morning in courtroom 305, the Miami-Dade County Courthouse hosted a different kind of hearing. The grand ceremonial courtroom was filled to capacity as the state Supreme Court Chief Justice prepared to announce the findings of their comprehensive investigation. James Wilson sat in the front row, flanked by Sarah Martinez and Chief Judge Roberts, the young law clerk. In the matter of judicial misconduct investigation number 2025 GD001, the Chief Justice began, his voice carrying through the hushed room. This court has reached the following conclusions. The findings were devastating. Judge Patricia Henderson was permanently disbarred from practicing law in Florida. The investigation had revealed discriminatory practices affecting over 3,000 cases during her tenure. Furthermore, the Chief Justice continued, all cases handled by Judge Henderson over the past 5 years will be automatically reviewed. Defendants who face discriminatory treatment will have their cases reheard by a special panel of judges. In the back of the courtroom, several of Henderson's former victims wiped away tears. For them, this moment represented long-delayed justice. The reforms sparked by the incident reached far beyond Miami. The state legislature had fast-tracked a Judicial Accountability Act, creating new oversight mechanisms and requiring regular reviews of judicial conduct. This case has exposed systemic failures that we cannot ignore, the Chief Justice declared. Therefore, we are implementing mandatory bias training for all judicial officials and establishing an independent review board to monitor courtroom conduct. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of people gathered to watch the proceedings on large screens. The crowd included activists, former defendants, and citizens who had been following the story since it broke. Sarah Martinez approached the podium to present her findings. Her voice, once hesitant, now carried the confidence of someone who knew she had done the right thing. The documentation shows a clear pattern, she explained, displaying charts and statistics. Minority defendants received sentences averaging 40% longer than white defendants for identical charges. The disparity cannot be explained by any factor other than racial bias. James Wilson's role had evolved from catalyst to advisor. The CIA had granted him special permission to assist with the reform process, recognizing the national security implications of a compromised justice system. Discrimination in our courts doesn't just hurt individuals, Wilson testified. It undermines the very foundation of our democracy. When people lose faith in the justice system, they lose faith in America itself. Former Judge Henderson watched the proceedings from her home, under house arrest, pending criminal charges related to her financial dealings with private prisons. Her fall from power was complete. The defendant, Patricia Henderson, the Chief Justice announced, has also been referred to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. The evidence suggests her actions were not merely biased but criminally corrupt. The reforms continued to spread. Other states began reviewing their own judicial systems, using the Miami investigation as a model. Congressional hearings were scheduled to discuss federal oversight of state courts. In a quiet moment during a break in the proceedings, Wilson approached Sarah Martinez. "You're the real hero here," he told her. "My confrontation with Henderson just opened the door. Your years of careful documentation brought down the whole corrupt system." Sarah smiled, thinking about all the young law students who had contacted her, inspired by her example. "Sometimes," she replied, "you just have to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost." The final order from the Supreme Court created a new Office of Judicial Integrity, with Sarah Martinez appointed as its first director. Her first task would be training a team of observers to monitor courtroom conduct across the state. As the sun set on this historic day, the courthouse steps hosted a celebration. Former defendants whose cases would be reviewed shared hugs with lawyers who have volunteered to help them. Civil rights leaders spoke about the power of individual courage to change broken systems. James Wilson slipped away quietly, returning to his CIA duties. His traffic ticket, the spark that had ignited this transformation, was long forgotten. But his impact on the justice system would be felt for generations to come. The story of Courtroom 305 became a case study in law schools across the country, teaching future lawyers and judges about the importance of integrity, courage, and equal justice under law. In the end, what began as one man standing up to injustice had grown into a movement that transformed an entire system, proving that justice, though sometimes delayed, would ultimately prevail.